Achieving SDGs through Voluntary Sustainability Standards, what role for public procurement and trade policy. My name is Santiago Fernandez de Cordova. I'm a senior economist in UNCTAD. I'm the coordinator of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards. UNFSS is a platform of 5 UN agencies, FAO, ITC, UNEP, UNIDO, and UNCTAD, working on voluntary sustainability standards and supporting developing countries on the challenges and opportunities of voluntary sustainability standards. This panel today, we're here to talk about VSS as a market-based tool to help us achieve SDGs, in particular by transforming the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we trade. And of course, this is something very important and fundamental, especially in these COVID days, where we're seeing how global value chains are being affected, are being in a way challenged. And hence, it's a very timely panel to talk about voluntary sustainability standards and their role in international trade. Today, we're going to listen or hear 2 presentations from 2 new research studies publications that have been recently launched. One is the 4th UNFSS Flagship report on upscaling voluntary sustainability standards through sustainable public procurement and trade policy. And the second one is a joint study between ITC, UNCTAD, University of Amsterdam, European University Institute, and the German Development Institute on linking VSS to SDGs. And having said that, I don't want to take more time. We have a very good panel today. We have 4 excellent speakers, and we have with us Professor Axel Marx. We have with us Sandra Cabrera from ITC. We have Bernard Hochman from EUI and Christian Robin from SECO. I will briefly introduce each speaker, and I will ask each speaker to give their presentation, their first round of presentation, before we can sort of start having a dialogue with questions and answers. So Axel will present to us the 4th United Nations Flagship. He's one of the lead co-authors of this publication, which was recently launched just a couple of weeks ago. Axel is Deputy Director at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies in the University of Leuven. Axel has extensively published over 150 publications in reference journals. He has managed over 50 research and development projects international from various institutions. And Axel, of course, has quite an extensive knowledge on voluntary sustainability standards, in particular on the emergencies, the development, the design of effectiveness of VSS. So Axel, the presentation to you so we can hear your presentation.
Thank you very much, Santiago. And it's my pleasure to be on this panel to discuss voluntary sustainability standards. And as you said, that I will present the 4th Flagship report of the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, named Scaling Up Voluntary Sustainability Standards to Sustainable Public Procurement and Trade Policy, which we jointly made with Santiago and his team, and quite a few others contributed to different parts of the report, and it's available online. What I want to do today is to briefly run you through what we have done in the report and give some of the key arguments we want to push forward. In this report, and the rationale for the report started very much from this idea of the contribution voluntary sustainability standards can make to sustainable development, and especially the Sustainable Development Goals. And you will hear much more about that because there's a separate report on it, which will be presented shortly. But they have a potential to contribute to sustainable development. And one of the main reasons we argue in the report why that is that actually, let's say, the normative basis of the Sustainable Development Goals, the international conventions to which they refer, ILO, Paris, and and so on, are also the bedrock and the founding principles of many voluntary sustainability standards. What voluntary sustainability standards add to these already international commitments is that they put in place a specific set of procedures and rules to make sure that people who use the standards, producers, farmers, and so on, comply with the sustainability standards. And in that way, it's a complement directed towards the private sector to translate international commitments into actionable rules and procedures for companies. So that's why there might be a very interesting tool to work with to achieve the SDGs. Second part of the argument or the rationale is actually that when we then look at these standards, we have to think about their effectiveness, and that can be on two dimensions. One is, do they really create a sustainability impact? And that's really about the effectiveness on the ground. And that's something we don't deal with in the report. We assume that there is an impact, and I know there's a lot of discussion about it, and there's a lot of variation, but on certain aspects of sustainability, they do create an impact. But another part of the effectiveness question is, of course, that you can have an impact on the ground, but if you're hardly used, if you're hardly adopted, if the uptake is very low, the overall contribution you might make to sustainable development is actually limited. So in order to really create an impact, you need to have impact on the ground, and you need to have being used widely. So you have to have high adoption, use, uptake levels. And that's where this report comes in. And that's what we want to analyze. And what we do in the first chapter, and we'll turn to it in a minute, is try to figure out on a set of indicators how we are doing with regard to VSS uptake and some of the trends there. Then one of the takeaway points we do from that is that actually VSS, we argue, are established market governance instrument, but the uptake or the adoption could be increased. And then one can think about different avenues, different mechanisms to increase the uptake of VSS. That can be done by business, and you have a lot of multinationals and companies doing pledges towards sustainability and integrating voluntary sustainability standards. That can be done through consumers who demand sustainable products. But as we argue, that can also be done by governments and public policy. And that can be done by governments and public policy through a wide range of actions and initiatives. But in the report, we focus on two: sustainable public procurement and trade policy. And we'll say a few things about that when we discuss chapters 2 and 3. So they can take through trade policy and sustainable public procurement, governments can take action. That might actually boost the uptake and adoption of voluntary sustainability standards, and in that way contribute to the effectiveness and contribute to the SDGs. In the final chapter, we take a bit of a more, not critical stand, but we want to reflect on what some of the possible implications are of this strategy to further integrate voluntary sustainability standards in public policies, and what might be, let's say, the pros and cons, because I think we also have to reflect about the possible implications of this. And I will end my presentation going into a few of these elements. Now, to come to the issue of uptake or adoption or use of standards. One can look at different indicators, and before we do that, I have to make, let's say, a conceptual clarification. We talk about uptake in the report, and uptake of standards typically happens on the level of a producer or a farmer or a forest owner or other economic actors. But in the literature, there's also a reference to uptake or adoption on the country level. And that's not necessarily that at a country level all these standards are adopted, but that these voluntary sustainability standards are present in specific countries and there develop activities and dynamics. Now, if we look at the uptake, one can look at different parameters. The first parameter we analyzed and looked at in the report itself is VSS themselves. Do we see an increase of these market-based mechanisms over time in order to try govern sustainability through market processes? And what you see in the graph on the left-hand side is data from the Eco-Label Index and from the IDC standards map, which basically map the evolution of the number of standards worldwide. And you can see two things. Actually, the numbers differ between the two databases, but the trend is exactly the same. We see that from 1990 onwards until 2015, there was a very sharp increase in the number of these VSS, and then there was a stagnation in these standards. And for us, the stagnation can be looked at from different perspectives, but one perspective we think of is looking at it from, let's say, a more consolidation point of view, that we actually now have a number of established voluntary sustainability standards in place for specific commodities. What the graph does not show is really the dynamic underlining the evolution of standards, because every year there are new standards out there and some standards stop. But let's say the more well-known ones and the established ones are still there, and they are actually consolidating a bit their position. Then, besides looking at the number of standards, one can look at the distribution of standards across economic sectors, and that's what you see on the right-hand side at the top, which is based on the ITC database, and which shows the number of standards across commodities and economic sectors. And the main takeaway point there is that, as we might know, there's a lot in agriculture and textiles and in certain consumer products, but not all sectors are covered. And that's an important point when we talk about sustainable public procurement. And I will come back to that. Third way to look at the adoption of standards is looking at the presence of these standards across countries. And that's what you see on the map. And what we did on the map is basically calculate the number of standards which are present in a country on the total number of standards. This is also based on the ITC database. And there you see, first of all, quite a lot of variation in terms of standards activities across countries. And that varies to a large degree with economic development level of those countries. What we also point out in the report is actually that there's quite interesting variation between economically quite similar countries, but they do differently in terms of adoption of standards. Why that's the case, that needs to be explored, but there is an interesting variation in that respect. That's, let's say, more the aggregated indicators on adoption. We also looked at adoption at the level of farmers, at the level of farmland, and these types of things. That's mainly based on existing literature. We don't have new data on that, except for a small case study we did on forest certification. But there we have already quite a lot of, I think, valuable data based on the state of sustainability markets, which annually reports on that. And the main takeaway here is that adoption has increased and keeps on increasing quite significantly over year, but that the overall level of adoption remains quite low. And when we look at our little case study on forest certification, we actually see that these adoption dynamics are not linear, but there's a lot of variation between countries, and in some countries there's a linear increase in adoption of standards, but in other countries standards were adopted quite significantly in the beginning and then peaked and then started to decline, just to illustrate that these dynamics are actually a bit different between countries, and what drives these dynamics needs to be further explored. So we have the VSS. They are, let's say, to a degree consolidated. They are used in the market, but the overall adoption levels are quite low. Then the second part is how can we increase adoption, if that's the aim we want to achieve. We look at sustainable public procurement in the report and at trade policy, and a few words on each. With regard to sustainable public procurement, as we know, certified products are bought. We buy them as consumers. Business might buy them from their suppliers, but of course, one of the biggest buyers on any market are governments, and they buy through public procurement. And actually quite a lot of, or quite a significant percentage of GDP of any government, and especially in the developing countries is even higher, goes to public procurement. This public procurement is now being revised, rethought in terms of sustainability, hence the emergence of the concept of sustainable public procurement. And that actually puts to the governments the additional challenge not only to buy the best value for money on the market, but also to take into consideration social and environmental aspects. And when governments do that, they might put out a tender, they put in social and environmental requirements out there, and then they might select the product they want to buy. But now to really know whether the product was made or is sustainable, they need shorthands, they need identification, they need markers to do that, and you can have independent assessment. But what we see occurring more and more is that in the buying guides, which governments then develop for their departments, for their local governments, and so on, there's reference to voluntary sustainability standards. If you go to the European Commission website, they have buying guides, they reference to sustainability standards. So they are already integrating sustainability standards in their public procurement, and that can create actually quite an important impact on the market. What we highlight in the report is this dynamic, how that occurs, and at the end we also discuss a little bit what are the, let's say, the possibilities of this. For certain commodities and products, this can work actually quite well. For others, certainly in areas sometimes for defense spending and healthcare, where there are less voluntary standards available, there might be limited or limitations to what you can achieve with this. But that's some of the elements we take into account. Second, we look at trade policy. And there we actually explore a little bit through different trade instruments what's currently being discussed or thought about in terms of voluntary sustainability standards. And we focus on four. One is free trade agreements, where we actually look at the trend database and some other data to look at, are voluntary sustainability standards already used in trade agreements, referred to in trade agreements? And there we highlight that, especially for the European ones, that is the case. In their trade and sustainable development chapters, they want to promote the use of these standards. And one of the reasons they might want to do it is because some of these standards might help producers also to integrate in global value chains. We look at the debate on GSP and the reform of the general systems of preferences to include VSS. And we sketch the debate in the report, and we're also a bit skeptical about what can be done in this respect, but it's a debate which is out there and which we try to map out. Then we look at how especially the EU is using VSS in what we might call import restrictions, but that we mean that market access has been made conditional on certain sustainability criteria. And we discuss some of the regulatory initiatives which are out, or like the EU timber regulation, the Renewable Energy Directive, and so on, which bring in certain elements of due diligence, which then integrate aspects of sustainability standards. And we also know that it's actually not only a dynamic in the EU, but we reference the new South Korea Timber Act and so on, where you see similar dynamics. Finally, export promotion. We discuss a few examples across the world where actually VSS are used in terms of export promotion, and we identify actually three mechanisms by which this occurs. This is first, having a VSS as a necessary requirement to get an export license. In certain countries like Vietnam, there are financial incentives for adoption of VSS, which then can boost export. And finally, we have some examples where we show that actually from the government there's technical and capacity building to adopt standards, which then again feed into the trade policy. So these are some of the mechanisms by which VSS are used or thought about in trade policy. Now, finally, in the final chapter, we start with the idea, okay, there can be more adoption. Yes, that can be pursued by public policy. But if we do that, what are possible implications, and do we really want that, in the sense that, is that what we want to achieve via VSS? VSS are tools to transform markets towards sustainability. If you would mainstream it completely, don't we lose a little bit of the innovative edge of VSS to do so? And these are some of the debates we want to engage with in the final chapter. And we have split that out under a few headings. One, we discussed the capacity of VSS to certify on a large scale. And we all know how VSS works through third-party auditing and these types of things, and whether you have to outsource the auditing for 2 farmers or 2 forest owners or for more, if there's the supply of consultancy companies who can do that, the upscaling will not have that much of an effect. But we also know that VSS sometimes actually very much care about how they transform markets and do not only rely on audits, but engage very deeply with producers and farmers to transform to sustainability practices. And in those types of situations or those types of governance models of VSS, it might not be possible to upscale very bigly in a short time. And one example might be, for instance, things happening with the Marine Stewardship Council at the time that when Walmart declared that they want to have all their frozen fish food certified. That creates an enormous demand, which a VSS might have a capacity to deal with. Second point we discussed a bit in depth is that with the increase in VSS, which I showed on the graph, and the proliferation of the Wild West of labels, as some might call it, we need recognition systems. We need to figure out which VSS are credible and which ones are less credible. And we run a little bit of risk with the integration in public policies. We already see it with some regulatory initiatives in the EU, that there are, let's say, a multiplication of recognition systems. And we need to think a little bit about what the implications are of that and whether there can be convergence and divergence of recognition systems. Third aspect we discuss in the report is whether this adoption impulse might not create an oversupply of certified products. In the end, VSS want to create certified markets. They don't want to certify products which then are sold on a market not under a label because there's just too little demand. And then finally, we highlight that the adoption of VSS or the initiatives to increase adoption of VSS can create distributional effects in terms of, especially for farmers and manufacturers in least developed countries, to adopt VSS. And if they cannot adopt VSS, although there's a big demand from, for instance, public buyers, that might actually exclude them from global trade rather than integrate them in global trade and create some kind of a dynamic towards more sustainable trade. So that's a bit in a nutshell, the key points and arguments presented in the 4th flagship publication. Thank you, Santiago.
No, thanks, Axel, for that presentation. It really brings us into the topic of voluntary sustainability standards and their impact on economic development and SDGs. I must say that, of course, we feel that and we see that standards are an important tool on international trade. They're an important tool with regards to sustainable development and all their implications. Let it be standards from the regulatory point of view, standards from the voluntary point of view. Then again, a lot of the voluntary sustainability standards, which are market-based tools, have come to existence in a way because they address some of those issues that are fundamental for us, as human beings, those economic issues, those social issues, or environmental issues that sometimes have not been dealt with through a regulatory framework as they should have been. Now, the question that I let you to think maybe for the second part of this panel is, we have this nature of voluntary from the standards, something that is working on the market and that it's functioning in a way. If we kind of push it through these policy tools that we're looking at, and we're seeing already in the arena of trade policy, where there being sort of referred or referenced in some type of bilateral trade agreements, do we have the risk of how do we deal with this, with the essence, with the regulatory side? Will they become some type of non-tariff barriers? And then again, the question, because this is sort of the Geneva Trade Week, it's also related about how compatible is it with WTO rules and the GATT rules, in particular with all those principles of MFN and non-discriminatory essence of this policy too. So I leave you with those sort of comments so that you can prepare my questions when the time comes from the dialogue. Now I would like to turn to Sandra. Sandra works in ITC. She's going to present to us more the sustainable development side of the voluntary sustainability standards through the study that they have done. She's the lead author of this study. Sandra is the sustainability standards and value chain manager in the T4SD program in ITC. She has extensive experience in sustainable sourcing strategies at the company, at the sectoral level. She's actually very also knowledgeable on the technical sides of standards and sustainability, in particular because she works very often and manages a lot of projects in the field on sustainability standards. Mainly, I know of your projects in Peru, Colombia, Costa Rica, and you have extensive experience training that. So we're very eager to hear a bit of your presentation and listen a bit more about what this study has found in terms of the links of VSS and SDG. To you, Sandra.
Thank you, Santiago, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope that you and your loved ones are healthy and then united more than ever in these special times. I think it's important to say. So I will do the presentation and maybe I will stop my video so we don't get distracted. The report that I will present to you today is called Linking Voluntary Standards to Sustainable Development Goals. I apologize for the title there. And at the United Nations, we have emphasized the alignment between competitiveness, sustainability, and inclusiveness to maximize economic and development impact. With the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, there is an imperative to work in synergies with the public, with the private actors, to work together and to translate this commitment to actions. On behalf of our partners, I'm pleased today to present a report that supports and builds on that approach. We want to increase the understanding of how voluntary sustainability standards can connect with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, and this will make possible to widen and advance the effort that we all make together to meet the SDGs, especially given that we just have 10 years to reach that goal. I have the pleasure to present these findings, the key findings of this publication. The study is being published today and was prepared jointly by ITC, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, the European University Institute, the University of Amsterdam, and the German Development Institute. This is a most in-depth research to date on specific links between the voluntary sustainability standards and the SDGs at the center of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I would say that these insights are especially valuable for developing countries because they have a drive for a future growth trajectory that is more sustainable and inclusive. They need to understand the links between voluntary standards and the SDGs and how this contributes to efforts that they are already making and building a more resilient business ecosystem, creating greener jobs, and building the business case for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to adopt greener ways to produce and to trade. So this report will help decision makers in the public and private sectors to understand where these voluntary standards are best places to contribute since it's mapping the linkages between these standards and each SDG goal, including the specific targets. Here we go. Second. With the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the United Nations has called on the private sector to contribute more to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We have seen in the recent years, business around the world have been active in mobilizing and networking around the 2030 Agenda, supply chain audits, using supply chain audit certifications. These are widely used tools to assess and improve sustainability practice in global production networks. If we name these instruments, we often know them as Voluntary Sustainability Standards, or VSS. These VSS, we know that some are created by industry consortia, some by non-governmental organizations, others by multi-stakeholder initiative. There are major VSS programs that we all know, like Global Gap, Rainforest Alliance, or Fair Trade, Labeling Organization, or the Forest Stewardship Council, for example. We have mapped all these initiatives in a database that we call the Standards Map. It's a database of the International Trade Center. It's one of the most comprehensive databases on standard-based sustainability initiative. We have more than 270 VSS covering more than 600 product groups and 15 industry sectors in more than 180 countries. So as you can see, and as already in the previous presentation was said, voluntary standards are increasingly present in the global economy. And although there is a growing interest from policymakers, business leaders, academics, and the potential of these supply chain instruments to help achieve sustainable development objectives, surprisingly, we don't know how exactly this VSS, well, until now, how exactly these VSS and SDGs are interlinked. So this caught our attention, and we began to ask ourselves the following questions. Do the requirements of voluntary standards correspond to the SDGs and their targets? And if so, to what degree? Another question that we were trying to answer through this report was if and how the SDGs and the targets are covered by the VSS, and then in which countries and sectors are voluntary sustainability standards available to help achieve the SDGs objectives. So to this end, the study draws a systematic mapping. We work on a systematic mapping of 232 private standards that we selected from the database standards map. And we did the revision of 800 requirements of the VSS against the 17 SDGs and their 169 targets. Based on this, we identified existing overlaps and gaps between the VSS landscape and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Of course, it's important to mention that the linkages that we examined in this study are just one element in the complex discussion regarding the role of VSS in implementing the SDGs. The effectiveness of VSS in governing conditions in supply chains depends on many factors: their institutional design, the accessibility, the legitimacy, the market coverage, the implementation context. So we are not giving conclusions on how impactful these VSS are. We're just, setting the scene and showing in a very practical way the overlaps that there is between the VSS requirements or the content of voluntary sustainability standard and the SDG at a goal level and target level. So this systematic survey of the links between SDGs is a first step to better understand the potential for these VSS instruments to contribute to sustainable development objectives. So as I mentioned before, the data that we use in the report comes from the ITC standards map from ITC. We selected the 232 private sustainability standards. When I talk about private VSS, we're talking about the standards that are not created by government agencies or international organizations. And we also didn't include firm level codes of conduct in the analysis. While doing the mapping, we focus on 126 core targets of the 17 SDGs, because you can imagine that the rest of the targets were very much speaking to government role. So there was not a way to translate those goals or targets to the VSS requirements or actions that these instruments can take. Then what was important was not only connect the requirements and the targets, it was also important to evaluate the degree of the connections. So when a requirement could be considered linked to an SDG target, we really look into the criteria and the actions that the VSS requirement was requesting the companies to comply with, and they were relevant for achieving the SDG target. So in that way, the coding exercise that we made, it made it possible to aggregate information at the SDG level. So then after doing the mapping exercise, establishing the connections between the VSS requirements and the SDG targets, we introduced two additional parameters. So the precision and the correspondence. So to be included in the analysis, a linkage between a voluntary standard and an SDG target needed to meet two conditions. The content of the VSS requirement must be described with a certain level of precision, so high or medium precision. And the second condition, the content of the VSS requirement must closely correspond to the key content of the SDG. So then we said there was a high correspondence. So what I will show you in the next slides is taking into account linkages of the set of requirements with two SDGs goals or targets with a medium or high precision or high corresponding linkage. Okay? Then we also use a linkage indicator to quantify the coverage of requirements. This is based on the assumption that everything else being equal, the linkage between the VSS system and the SDG target will be higher if the VSS has more requirements that are relevant for the SDG target. Maybe I'm getting a little bit too technical. So let's see the results of some analysis, so the key findings. I think it's more interesting. So we examined the connections between voluntary standards and the SDGs and the targets, including at the country and sectoral levels. The first objective was to identify and describe the area of interlinkage between the landscape of VSS and SDGs, as I said in the previous slides. We found an area of interlinkage between VSS SDGs of 508 requirements out of 800 that our database had could be linked to 16 SDGs and 55 targets of the goals. So in this slide, you can see the links at SDG level. So we needed to look first at the level of the 17 Sustainability Development Goals. The graph that you see here illustrates a number of voluntary standards that include at least one requirement that overlaps with at least one target of each SDG, counting only linkages that satisfy the conditions of high, medium, precision, high correspondence. It shows that there are multiple linkages and there is a substantial variation across the SDGs. For example, we found that 200 or more voluntary standards are linked to SDG 2, that refers to zero hunger, SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, SDG 12, responsible production and consumption. There is a potential to align to more SDGs, and if you don't find them in this list here, it doesn't mean that there is no alignment with other SDGs. There are at least 100 standards linked to SDG 16, SDG 15, 5, 7, and 10. I need to go a little bit faster.
Yeah, I think so. I think, Sandra, we need to go a bit faster.
How much time do I have?
I think you're over time, but anyway, I know I don't want to interrupt you much. I don't want to. We can take some of the issues also with the Q&A and dialogue, but please go through with the results of the study.
Thank you, Santiago. So in order to understand in a greater depth the nature of links between voluntary standards and the SDGs, we needed to look at the overlap with the SDG targets. Here you can see an example of the SDG 8 and the links to its targets. You can see that some of the targets are covered in a greater extent, others are not, but that doesn't mean that the VSS cannot, I mean, in some situations, it's because the VSS, of course, cannot, for example, strengthen the capacity of financial institutions in this case with 8.10 target, right? So we have to see at the different issues, and that's why this study is looking at in a granular way how these sustainability issues will overlap and can be really addressed by VSS. And if not, then it's because, well, the goals are not speaking to the system and to the mandate of the SDG, of the VSS, sorry. Let me show you another one. This is also an important finding. Well, we have also links at the country and sector levels. You will see here, for example, that some of the number of VSS that we have per country and to a specific SDG. In the case we follow the same example with SDG 8, and we have results of how many standards are linked to each of the targets of SDG 8. I think that's very important when the countries want to prioritize certain issues. The fact that some countries have more VSS than others, that doesn't mean that well, that just means that they have more to choose to address these different sustainability issues. But we are not talking about the level of impact that these VSS can have in the country once they are implemented. There is also a link at the sector level. And if we go with the example of SDG 8, we can see here that, well, the number of the VSS is highest in the agricultural sector, then the consumer products and the textile garments. And there is also certain products and commodity that have stand out and have more VSS related. So soy sector and the coffee and cocoa sector, for example. Key takeaways, well, the world of private sustainability standards and the SDGs overlap to a significant degree. You have seen it. 53 targets out of 169, 16 SDGs. They are a tool that are widely used across countries and sectors, and they have the potential to contribute to the achievement of the SDGs. I compliment and the work that we international organizations are doing. Maybe I will stop here. There is some recommendations of habits that I mentioned before, and then the recommendations that we put together for the way forward for the different relevant actors and will be interested on this. I will stop here. Thank you.
No, thanks, Sandra, for that presentation. It really shows that the research is very deep and there's a lot of information in there. Of course, as United Nations, when we look at the issue of voluntary sustainability standards, we have to sort of benchmark the issue with regards to the SDGs. And of course, the question here is about data, it's about transparency and certain issues like that. Maybe when we get to the Q&A, you can comment to us a bit about how really in the producing side, in the exporting side, in some developing countries, how they can cope with voluntary sustainability standards in terms of like really, if we consider it a policy tool, what else it's needed to be put in place so that they can also take advantage of this policy tool. Now, let me turn to our third panelist. It's Bernard Hochman. I think Bernard probably doesn't really need much of an introduction because I think I counted you were on two or three panels already in the Geneva Trade Week, so I'm sure that you were introduced quite widely. But in any case, let me just say that he's professor and program director of global economics at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at EDUI. He's also currently the chair at the World Economic Forum of Global Action Council on Supply Chain and Logistics. He's widely published. The number of publications exceeds the number that can be counted. But I've asked Bernard to please give us his insights on specifically on voluntary sustainability standards as a policy tool, and of course on these two research pieces that we as United Nations with other partners are putting forward to try to create a bit more of transparency on the issue. So Bernard, to you, please.
Thanks for the nice introduction, Santiago, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, if it is virtual. So as was mentioned, I was asked to comment on these two reports. Doing that in a few minutes is impossible to do justice to them. There's a lot of very detailed and interesting information in both, so I encourage everyone to have a look at both reports. So I'm just going to a few reflections. So on the first one, the UNFSS report, I think one of the takeaways for me from this, as we try and as we think about trying to link voluntary sustainability standards to policy, I think one of the things that came out to me is that we really need to have a stronger governance framework to do that. And that's both needed to ensure transparency, but also it's needed to encourage voice, to use some Hirschman terminology. And that's especially the case insofar as voluntary sustainability standards get embedded in domestic legislation, right? So whether it's by reference, or whether it's through inclusion into a trade agreement, or whether it's through inclusion into criteria that have to be met in order to be eligible to win a public procurement contract. Right, and we don't have that, and I think that is a problem, and I think that is something where potentially, at the multilateral level, things can and should be done, and the WTO is the obvious place to do that. Second takeaway from the UNFSS report is the point that Axel mentioned. There's a whole section in the report on convergence, divergence of recognition systems, and this potential problem of over certification and, in a sense, too many standards. So that calls firstly for a lot more analysis and understanding to what extent there actually is overlap and redundancy. And I think this is the type of work which is being done, which I think is very important. But it also points to the importance, I think, of focusing much more on trying to determine which standards are actually equivalent. Right, and that gets us, again, in terms of multilateral cooperation or international cooperation, think about mechanisms to actually help identify where there is actually a lot of overlap. And what that then means is all of those standards should then be referenced in procurement, in trade policy, whatever the instruments governments might end up using, basically to make the point that saying, listen, we don't pick one. There's a whole slew of them out there. Any one of them is for us as a government, as a procuring entity, good enough, right? Equivalent. And I think that in itself, going through that exercise would be very useful to ultimately then try and bring that up to an international level where we say, okay, let's actually have an agreement among governments that the following actually are equivalent. And the obvious instrument for that is, given the focus that there is today on plurilateral cooperation outside of trade agreements, is to think about a plurilateral agreement that actually does that. The second report, I think, is really interesting and important because this mapping exercise between VSS systems and the SDGs is something we need to do much more generally, right? So that also applies to public policies. And I think one of the interesting things there that is being kind of hinted at or pointed to in that report is, where do we actually have complementarities? Right? Or where are there synergies between kind of public policies which are aimed at actually achieving SDGs, and how can these voluntary systems help achieve that? But I think in terms of making it easier for governments to identify where these synergies or complementarities between public policies, including trade policy, and VSS standards exist, we really need very detailed or much more detailed data on the market uptake for each of these systems. And that, of course, was the focus of Axel's presentation and the UNFSS reports. But we need a lot more of that. And I think here the big question is, and it's especially in terms of market shares, right? So that's the one thing we need to get a better sense of. We have a lot of these different systems. So what's the market share of each system in a particular country, globally? And that's important also to give advice in terms of, you know, which ones to focus on, but also to get an understanding of how they interact with each other. So here the big question, and we can debate this, is what's the best forum or institution to actually do this, right? So the ITC is doing a wonderful job with the standards map in terms of collecting all of these different types of standard systems, but that is associated with a relationship of trust between the ITC and these institutions and entities, right? And clearly, if you then let loose a bunch of economists on that data, they might come up with conclusions that are not particularly amenable or consistent with claims that are made. So I think it's important to think about the institutional incentives in terms of doing that type of work. And there again, I would argue for a plurilateral type of framework, right? And in a sense, what the UNFSS has already done is it's kind of created that already, right? Because we have the UNCTAD, we have the ITC, we have academics, we have all these multi-stakeholder institutions and initiatives which are doing the VSS. They're all parts of this family in a sense. So I think that's a very strong point, and I would then encourage everyone to kind of think about, okay, what can we do to kind of create a plurilateral framework around all of that to actually encourage and also resource, because it will take resources, the work that needs to be done to actually map market shares, to figure out what the effects are and the effectiveness of different programs are. Let me now return briefly. My final comment is on the governance framework again, going back to Axel's report. There, I think we really need, it's past time to think about kind of something along the lines of a reference paper or a code of conduct, which actually kind of lays down some good regulatory practices, if I can call it that, in terms of how these things actually should connect to the mandatory world of policy, right? And I'm not going to go through what those principles might be. That's something that needs to be worked out. But I think it is something that, again, lends itself for a plurilateral approach. And big question here, again, is should that be the WTO? I think doing it in the WTO on a multilateral basis is probably a bridge too far. But I do think this plurilateral type of joint statement initiative approach could be a good one to do this. And I think it would be really beneficial for the WTO to do that, because it would move the WTO away from the state-to-state kind of characterization of all the interactions there and bring in people who are actually doing this type of work, which are, of course, civil society, which would include the elements of the private sector. And I think that's exactly what we need in the WTO to actually keep the WTO relevant for its stakeholder. Final comment, I think from a research point of view, I'm a researcher. Making all of this data public and keeping it public, I think is really important, because that encourages other people to use it for analysis. And that's, of course, part of the process of figuring out how these things work and how they can be improved. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Bernard. It's really a pleasure to hear you and hear your reflections on the issue. For us, it's really like fundamental to hear how things can evolve, because of course we come from a trade world, but here we're faced with a sort of voluntary instrument that is being widely used by the markets. And then again, we have to figure out as policy, as a related government policy, how to deal with this kind of policy instrument. I must say, just to add up to two things very quickly before I let Christian do his presentation, is like, yes, one of the issues is it's really difficult to know how this issue about voluntary sustainability standards can be dealt in WTO. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of member states have looked at the UN, at the United Nations, to have more transparency, more understanding on these issues. Now, then again, is it going to happen in terms of a plurilateral agreement or not? We also have to balance the fact that many of these instruments are B2C or B2B, sort of outside of the helm of the governmental side. But I want to leave it like that, because of course, maybe somebody wants to pick up on that. Of course, I just want to mention this word that you use, which is the market share, the information, having the data. I think we have discussed extensively, and the word that you use is the footprint. I really like the word that, Bernard, you have used in the past, which is called footprint. We have to figure out what is the real footprint of this sort of policy instrument, so that we can figure out how we can see the impact and the implications. Again, you know, it's very difficult, and we're very willing to work on it, and it might be something that we might want to pick up. Now, let me turn to Christian, because Christian, of course, he serves as Deputy Head of Trade Promotion at the Swiss State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, SECO, and one of his main tasks is to oversee and manage certain initiatives related to voluntary sustainability standards in global value chains. Hence, we have a sort of a Christian's experience in working with this policy tool for a number of years. And of course, we have seen how it has been reflected in Axel's study. Trade promotion is fundamental for the uptake of voluntary sustainability standards. So we wanted to hear a bit Christian views on the issue that we're discussing in relation to VSS and SDGs. Christian, to you.
Hello, thank you, Santiago. Thank you for this nice introduction. It's a pleasure being here. We very much applaud this UN interagency effort to dialogue around the voluntary sustainability standards. I try to complement the very rich previous reflections which we have heard. I will do so from, let's say, from a donor's perspective, but also somehow from a policymaker perspective, because the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs is a donor agency in the area of economic development cooperation, but SECO is also, as lots of you know, is also responsible for trade policy. We also are responsible for labor market policy. And also you have a say in what is public procurement, where the scaling up of sustainability standard is so important. I will try to be very brief and get to the essence and try to, as much as possible, complement what has been said. Now I think I have to turn into the other direction. Yes, I think I can skip that. SECO, it has an important role in development cooperation. We are part of the Sustainable Trade Division, and as SECO, we've been following the field or the system of sustainability standards, I would say, since decades. As a donor, we have been supporting this system of voluntary private sustainability standards in various fields. Here you see different boxes which somehow represent the complementary support we provided over the past decades, I can say. Of course, not all the boxes, not all the topics have been equally important. At the very beginning, seed funding of certain labels and standards have been important. SECO has been also a sponsor of the fair trade system, but also SECO has been involved in many mainstream standards like the Better Cotton Initiative, the Common Code for Coffee, but also the RTRS in the soy sector. But over the past few years, what we've been doing, and this is very much related to what has been said by Bernard Hockmann, when it comes to the governments, we were really trying to strengthen the system as a whole. We wanted to seek to foster transparency, and here the work with ITC has been so instrumental. But of course, capacity building is important, which allows that producers in developing countries, they are really fit to adopt the sustainability standards. And what is important is also to mention the role of ISEAL. ISEAL is not yet a plurilateral agreement. It's a small organization based in London, but ISEAL is an organization which defined good sustainability standards practice. 3 codes are critical for the systems: the code for standard setting, the code for assurance, but also the code for impact. The main sustainability standards, they follow these standards. ISEAL has a role to do the oversight and also to foster peer learning and community learning. I think this, for us, it's an interesting basis if you think further of an enhanced plurilateral effort, which is certainly an interesting idea which we should explore further. And we also think the role of UNFS is critical. That's why also SECO is a strong believer in the role of UNFS and the interagency coordination put forward by this important network. Then let's go to the next one. This data, which we took from T4SD, it's ITC data, which was collected together with FIBL. It simply shows that VSS are widely used, as has been said. It has been mainstream. What we see is that in many commodity sectors, sustainability standards reached a double-digit share of world production. Now the question, is this enough? What can be done to scale up the impact of sustainability standards? And they're building up on what has been said before. What we see now, and this is really different maybe from the start of sustainability standards. Now it's definitely not only consumers. Today we have many drivers for enhanced sustainability in global value chains. We do have the regulators in trade policy, public procurement. We have the whole due diligence discussions when it comes to the human rights, but we also have the banks. Now the ESG policies are important to virtually all important banking institutions. And last but not least, we have also the big corporate actors, the big companies which have made corporate pledges. So these all helps to mainstream sustainability and also helps to scale up the use of sustainability standards. I'd like to go already to the next slide to make my presentation a little bit shorter because it somehow explains in a graphic way where we see the potential future or even already the presence of sustainability standards. We think what is needed is comprehensive agreements, sector-wide agreements, or nation-wide agreements where sustainability policy were defined, and there, looking at this pyramid, you see different tools, different rules, which somehow comprise the sustainability pyramid. And what is important to know that the different standards, being mainstreaming standards, niche standards, but also the national or international rules, they're all important. And they also all somehow respond to different drivers. I just been mentioned before. Of course, the consumers, they're basically interested in what is happening in the area of the labels, of the consumer-facing labels, to differentiate, to have a certain market differentiation. But then the others drivers, when we talk about big corporate commitments or ESG policies, there, of course, mainstreaming standards are of greater relevance, and mainstream standards can also become an important implementing vehicle for international rules and agreements, as also has been said by the previous presenters. This is a little bit theoretic. I'd like to just mention two examples. I'd like to mention two examples. One example is example from a consumer countries, precisely Switzerland. And then the second example is from a producer country perspective. One example which SECO has been closely involved is the establishment of the Swiss platform for sustainable cocoa. It's a sector-wide effort, a sector-wide agreement, so to speak, of all stakeholders which are relevant in this, let's say, Swiss chocolate industry. The Swiss platform for sustainable cocoa is now an association, and virtually all Swiss chocolate manufacturers are members of this platform, but also the traders, the importers, but also and the retailers belong to this platform. And also civil society is associated. And last but not least, we as SECO, representing the Swiss government, we are also part of this Swiss platform. And there, in this context, sustainability standards are important because the platform has defined a sustainable sourcing goal. In the long term, all cocoa and derivatives, they should originate from sustainable sources. There is a first intermediate step that we will reach 80% of these imports by 2025. And together with ITC, we've been carrying out a benchmarking assessment to see which standard is fit for purpose. And there we are reviewing with the support of ITC the main standards which are relevant for the cocoa sector, which is certainly fair trade, which is rainforest, which is the organic standards, but which is also the new ISO SEN standard on sustainable cocoa. What is important there is the whole work of the Swiss platform for sustainable cocoa. It's a Swiss effort, but it's strongly coordinated and aligned with the efforts by other European countries. Particularly, it's coordinated with the German initiative, which is called GISCO. It's coordinated with the Belgian government, the Belgian sector-wide effort, and also it's coordinated with the Dutch initiative for sustainable cocoa. And this is important to really scale up the impact of sustainability standards, that not only one country is trying to foster the uptake of sustainability standards and to foster sustainable sourcing, but it's being done with other important consumer countries. And I think somehow in the background, this is important. We have, of course, the current discussions in the EU to have mandatory approaches, due diligence regulations for the cocoa sector. And these discussions, I would say, could potentially underpin and reinforce the current efforts to strengthen sustainable sourcing practice in Europe. Then let's go to the second and last example, which is an example from Peru. Actually, I'm not the person who should speak on behalf of Peru, but I'm mentioning this example, which is the Peru's National Action Plan for Coffee, because SECO is supporting this effort. Actually, the coordination work is done through UNDP. UNDP has a program called Green Commodity Program, and the Green Commodity Program precisely looks in different producing countries in key commodity sectors with widespread sustainability issues to develop sector-wide agreements, sector-wide sustainability plans, to have joint monitoring mechanisms to bring all stakeholders together. And this Peru National Action Plan for Coffee 2019 to 2030 is precisely such an example, which we consider as a promising example. What is interesting here, of course, Peru, coffee is very important, is the main agriculture export commodity. It's reaching out to many producers' family. And what it is interesting from a VSA perspective is Peru traditionally has been a producer country where sustainability standards, particularly the niche standards, the consumer-facing labels such as fair trade and organic, has been very, very important. Today, Peru is the second biggest exporter of organic coffee, certified coffee, and it is the principal supplier of fair trade coffee to the US market. But now, of course, Peru, the producers, the stakeholders, they're aware that more needs to be done to really address the sustainability challenges in the social areas, but also in the environmental areas. And for that to happen, it needs a coordinated, a concerted effort involving all stakeholders. And this is precisely the goal of the National Action Plan for Coffee, which has been also now endorsed by the government. There is a national regulation which somehow defines the implementation of this plan. And I don't want to go into detail, but the targets, of course, they address export figures, but also it includes climate targets. It plans to reduce the global EA emissions in a very substantial way. And of course, it has specific targets in the area of livelihood of coffee producers and their families. And of course, they're in the process of setting up a comprehensive but hopefully functional monitoring systems, which in a medium perspective, hopefully can also guide decision-making by both businesses and governments. These two examples somehow show the potential way forward. Of course, sustainability standards, they play an important role, but it's not only about sustainability standards. Sustainability standards play a particular role in this more complex context. Thank you. That's actually what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Christian, for that presentation. I forgot to say in the introduction that you were head of the country program in Peru for SECO, so I understand why you have this kind of knowledge. And also, thank you. I knew you were going to refer in your presentation to the Code of Conduct of ISEAL, so I knew that this was something that needed to be discussed specifically in terms of ISEAL being an umbrella organization of many of these standards and how it functions as a governance issue. But one of the main concerns from the UN point of view is how can we bring more the voice of emerging developing countries, governments, and in groups of interest, civil society into this kind of discussions in multi-stakeholders approaches. I think there are many good ideas. We don't have too much time. I've been a terrible moderator. We only have like 15 minutes. So I want to really pick on each of you, maybe have 2 minutes on some comments. And I think actually, I'll just go back to Axel. I think Bernard did an excellent point putting some questions to you. And I really wanted to hear a bit more on impressions, Axel, on the issues related to the governance questions, specifically that he's mentioned. Also the issue related about plurilateral agreement on how to do the convergence, certification, and things like that. And of course, the issue about how to do better research on this. So Axel, to you, the questions that Bernard put through me to you.
Thank you very much, Santiago. I noted down 4 things. I will very quickly go over them, and especially Bernard's excellent remarks. But you mentioned 2 things in the beginning, maybe worthwhile highlighting. Question whether it constitutes a non-tariff barrier to trade or not. Of course, these standards do constitute non-tariff barriers, but the EU is constantly, let's say, exporting regulatory rules, whether it's on sustainability, on GDPR. All these standards, of course, influence trade. The question is whether they are illegitimate or legitimate barriers or rules which are in the trading system. That's a very different debate. On the WTO compatibility, we know that's a very big issue. And what's the issue here is what we discuss in the report is really the use of voluntary standards in a promotional way. So they are referred to in a trade agreement, they are maybe can be referred to in GSP. And that's quite harmless, I think. The big issue occurs when you would use VSS to have tariff differentiation. So if you would have lower tariffs on certified products versus non-certified products, and there the whole issue of WTO compatibility and whether you can have tariff differentiation on the basis of production methods comes into play, and it's a big issue. The only thing, I'm not a lawyer in this, the only thing I can observe is that there is by far no consensus on what the position is. Now to Bernard's points, first on the governance framework, I actually think that's spot on. It's about certifying the certifiers, finding a structure to distinguish credible from non-credible schemes. Bernard referred to maybe WTO making a reference paper. I think similar proposals have been made by Petros Mavroidis and Wolf in the World Trade Review, and I think urgent and good action is needed on that, because otherwise you really get a bit of a proliferation of recognition systems and a little bit less or no regulation of standards. So I would very much encourage a stronger governance structure. Bernard proposed WTO. I think that's quite an obvious place to do. I don't know whether we can discuss other fora where that might happen, but that's something we need to consider. Then on that equivalence question, also an excellent point. Let me say 2 things about it. So you can have a system in place where equivalence of standards is recognized, and that can also be in a plurilateral agreement. But in that respect, I also think we need to think a little bit about what standards themselves can do to create a bit more of equivalence, in the sense that we did a study already quite some time ago to the degree there's recognition between standards, and so hence recognizing one another. And actually the level of mutual recognition of standards is extremely low. And that has multiple reasons, but I think one reason might also make it very difficult for any plurilateral agreement to come to equivalence types of assessment is that these standards are based on many, many different aspects of sustainability and go into details on many different components of sustainability. So you typically have standards which would refer to social dimensions and freedom of association, and you have standards who don't do that. And if you have such a big diversity of standards, finding an overlap on which ones more or less try to achieve the same standards and goals might be quite challenging. So that might actually also be an issue to think through on how would you create an equivalence type of mechanism, and would that equivalence type of mechanism only focus on maybe some core aspects of sustainability, like maybe the ILO declaration or something else, or climate, but the issue that most of these standards actually not 1 or 2 aspects of sustainability, but many that might create problems for equivalence.
Thanks, Axel. Let's leave it like that. Of course, you being academic, you are allowed to say certain issues about NTBs and NTMs that we have a more difficult trouble saying about how they function with regards to global trade. And also, I understand the minimum common denominator could be a way of moving forward. Now, Sandra, let me give you the opportunity to just in 2 minutes, give us a bit of the sense from the producer side, from the developing country, on how this VSS are trade promotion tool, a sustainability tool, and how you see it in ITC. Sandra.
Thank you, Santiago. Well, I can mention the case of Costa Rica, that we also are a developing country, but we have it in the report, and it's how this country has developed a national country brand strategy. And you hear me, right?
We hear you.
And as part of that, they have worked on a sustainability business protocol. And they have included in that criteria that come from 15 different VSS, sustainability related and related to competitiveness as well. And this has allowed for the companies to make the connections between what they have to comply in terms of sustainable practices following this protocol, and then for Costa Rica to understand what is the contribution that these companies are doing by following this sustainability protocol to the national, let's say, agenda that respond to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So you see here synchronized, coordinated approach that the government has put in place, and we see it. They have positioned themselves as a country that is moving forward and trademark sustainability. So that is one good example, I think, how the different actors can coordinate at the public and private level.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. We know that a lot of things are moving in the South in countries like Costa Rica, China, Brazil, and so on and so forth. A lot of the emerging countries are taking the VSS quite seriously. Now, before I will let Bernard maybe to be last. So, Christian, I wanted to pick a bit your sort of last comments, specifically because I think we're working a lot on a trade promotion sort of instrument where we're trying to move towards, this sustainable development goals in the trade promotion argument. We're also seeing this happen in trade agreements, the EFTA trade agreement with some countries like Indonesia. Is this the way forward? Is this what's going to happen in the next steps? Is it going to be then taken into some other kind of level, in your opinion? Feel free to comment on this question, or if you feel like, or whatever you feel like. The question was for Christian. Did you hear me, Christian?
Sorry, I thought the last question went to Bernard.
No, the question was, I spoke very fast.
Okay. No, I just think, it's, I think what is really happening now is this different scaling up strategies, they're taking place at different levels. I somehow believe that the government and international government role is interesting, but we have to be aware that the emergence of sustainability standards in the 90s was precisely somehow a response to the failure of international collaboration. I mean, we had Rio 92, then we have the failure at Seattle in 99. And in this context, it was the private self-regulatory schemes which emerged, and nowadays we do have certain self-regulatory efforts which also are defining what is good practice, as some sort of system, some sort of governance is being strengthened. We are more than open to see what is the potential role of international governance in this plurilateral agreement, but we have to be aware that international collaboration in this field is important. Somehow it is a mix of bottom-up approaches and maybe some dialogue efforts in which I think UNFS plays a very interesting role.
Thanks, Christian. I think you're right. We have to try in various angles and in various ways to move the agenda forward. Bernard, we have a question from the audience. It's related to, because they're really interested in how we can get some of this data that sometimes is inside the standards organizations. And of course, we need to do that to sort of do our studies. They're thinking about what kind of incentives or mechanisms can we put in place to get this data. And then, of course, you can pick up on this question or just give us your concluding ideas on what we have discussed in this panel.
Okay, thanks. So on the data incentives, and I would argue pretty much everyone who is involved in this particular arena cares about sustainable development, right? And I think everybody who is in the development world has now been kind of firmly convinced that you need to do both monitoring and evaluation, right? So I would argue if you're serious about what we're trying to do, then we should all be collaborating and providing that data. So maybe the best way to create incentives to provide and share data is to make it much more transparent who does not. So there might be one not particularly pleasant incentive, but I mean, that is one incentive. The other incentive is more on the positive side, and that very much goes to the donor community, is to really encourage these systems and organizations to do this, right? So I think, and I think it has to be recognized that if we think about the carrot side of the equation, this is not costless, right? So the work that has gone into kind of converting the ITC standards map into a tool for research that has been done by Matteo Fiorini and by Philip Schuler and others on that, that requires a lot of time, a lot of effort. So therefore, implicitly, that requires resources to cover those costs. So I think that is something where, again, from a donor perspective, you could actually say, okay, let's actually target some of those types of activities to make it possible. Because ultimately, the people who are involved in this business are very much focused on trying to improve livelihoods, trying to expand exports. They're not in the business of data collection and analysis. So I think we need to recognize that, and therefore mobilize the resources and the help and assistance needed for them to actually do what would be useful from a research and then ultimately from a policy making point of view. Let me just, in my final, I guess, minute or so, kind of piggyback on what Axel was saying with respect to defining equivalence is very difficult because we have very heterogeneous systems, right? Because everybody is kind of concerned on the margin much more with one particular element than someone else might be in terms of the differences across systems. And I think here again, I would come back to kind of the theme of this session, is this is something, and it's an issue where research can really help, right? Because one way of addressing this problem is to say, okay, let's look at outcomes, right? So let's see whether we can actually determine the extent to which different VSS systems have very similar outcomes, right? And then if you as a procuring entity or you as a government are really worried about outcomes of a particular type, right? Whatever those might be, clearly we're going to have different outcomes. Then you could say, well, based on what I am trying to do as a regulator or as a consumer or whatever, these 3, 4, 5 systems actually give us a very similar outcome. So therefore, for me, they're equivalent. Now, within that, one of them might be focusing much more on labor standards than another. But for me, ultimately, I've defined what I'm trying to achieve. And that's one way of trying to think about, okay, which ones are equivalent. All right, so that was kind of one thought I had on that. So actually, let me stop there. I think we're pretty much out of time anyway.
No, those are excellent comments, and they really also summarize a bit of how the thinking should go in moving forward. I think it's really like the way we should be addressing the issue. And just to mention before I wrap up the whole panel, I remember when you were wearing the World Bank hat, you had this thing about transparency in trade idea, which was basically brought a lot of information on the tariff, non-tariff, ad valorem. And without that effort that you led in the World Bank with other agencies, and you forced us in the in the UN system to get our game up, we wouldn't have been able to have the data that we have today, and we're able to be more transparent on the tariff and non-tariff world. So we have to do the same kind of effort on the voluntary sustainability standards with the caveats we have. And of course, there's the call for the donors on that kind of effort. And of course, we should also praise the effort that ITC is doing with Sustainability Map, which is a fantastic policy tool that can give a lot of transparency. Just to summarize, because it's been a really, really, really interesting panel, I really want to thank you, the four of you, for having brought all your ideas. I really have some takeaways, and I have some thoughts that I want to share with you. For once, it's really one of the key thoughts is we have to bring a bit more of the discussion on voluntary sustainability standards to the sort of multilateral trading system, the Geneva discussions. And for that, having just a panel in the Geneva Trade Week is fundamental. We need to bring this issue into the table, and we need to bring it as much as possible. Although it's a sort of voluntary market-based tool, related to businesses, corporations in many senses, but it does have to do a lot with the livelihood and that we have of opportunities from some developing countries. The idea is that how to move forward in terms of how to move the code of conduct. We already exist away in terms of the ISIL code of conduct, and how can that be moved into a sort of more governance system in the voluntary sustainability standards is something to look at. Also, the issue about equivalence is fundamental because, of course, if we want to avoid the divergence and we want to avoid also the multiplication of standards, let it be regulatory and non-regulatory, we also have to have ways of convergence, because when we talk to producers, they just ask us, we have 4 or 5 standards, they're asking us the same things, the cost is increasing, the certification cost is increasing, the audit cost is increasing, why should we use one or the other? So we need to help countries in figuring this out. And then the issue that I also think is fundamental is this market share footprint issue, this data issue, where we need to invest a lot of resources in finding ways of incentivizing more transparency on the data that's out there, more transparency on utilization rates, more transparency on price data, more transparency on how impact data. And of course, there's a lot of initiatives out there. We don't want to sort of be the unique initiative on this, but these are the sort of objectives of the agenda coming in the year or the years to come. To conclude, I want to thank you all. For me, it's a pleasure to moderate this panel with such excellent speakers and panelists. So thank you all, and I guess we can conclude this session in the Geneva Trade Week, one of the last sessions of this week, and thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I think we just...
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.